Well, good day to you. Today we're going to look at the New Testament again, specifically the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, and 1 Corinthians. Our central truth is the writings of the Apostle Paul provide instructions for the church. We know that the scripture was written for our instruction on how we should live. So, our key verse is taken from Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. That scripture there is a chronological, the Jew first, because as we read last time in the book of Acts, the Jews were presented the gospel first, and of course we know they rejected it, and so Paul went to the Gentile as agreed to by Peter and the first council of the church. So, Paul tells us in the book of Romans that he's not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God into salvation. Man had known about God from the very beginning, because we read also in Romans that man chose to not regard God, and he chose to make his own gods, which were made by hands. And we're not going to look at this today, but if we moved over to the 17th chapter of Romans, we would see Paul at Athens. And as you know, Paul was there looking at all the statues to their various gods, and he found this one statue that was to the unknown God. And Paul says, he's the one I want to tell you about. Because he said that the real God of this world is not one that's made by man's hands, that's one that's not made of stone or gold or silver, and he's one that can't be worshipped in their temples, but he's the creator of all things. Paul's writing to the Roman church was to instruct firstly in the law. The Jews knew the law, and they also knew that they couldn't live in the law, that they failed. They had to slaughter animals and offer them up, and those were only give them a covering for 1 year. The next year they had to go back and do this over and over again all through these years. The plan of Christ, the plan of his death and resurrection for humankind was planned from the beginning. And we read that the prophets, they looked forward to these things. They didn't understand it. But at this time, this was the time, the perfect time, when his plan was revealed. And that plan was through Christ, that he would come to this earth, that he would teach the people about righteousness, how to live, how to be saved, how to live a righteous life. Jesus told them the two great truths: to love thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love thy brother as thyself. The whole of the New Testament teaches us that God is love, and that God expects his children to love one another and to do good. The scripture tells us that we're to do good to all men, especially those who are the household of faith. So, if we combine all of the teachings, all of the problems in the early church, it all boils down to one thing: or two things: to love God because He loved us first, and to love others as He loves us, to be a servant to others and to help others, and to look at people that fail as really that's many times it's not their failing but our own failing of not being able to present the gospel as it should be presented. So, Paul wrote this Romans, and the first chapter of Romans, he tells us that God created the earth and that men, as I said before, knew God and they rejected God. They chose their own gods. And so he rejected men until this time, but as he brought Jesus to this place. And Paul wrote this. Paul's whole writings were about the restoration of man to God. The letters, the book of Romans, the book of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and the book of Galatians, these were all letters that Paul wrote to the different churches. And as I had talked about last time, the book of Acts is the foundation of the New Testament. We read there about Peter and Paul. We read about Barnabas and the others who traveled over the known world at that time, preaching and teaching and setting up churches. So the book of Romans, Paul is writing about doctrine. He's teaching us what it means to be a Christian and how we should live to be Christians. When we move to 1 Corinthians, we find that that was a church that Paul had founded, and he had stayed there at some time, and he had heard that there were, I will say, deviations from his teachings. And Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthian church, correcting them. And Paul's correction was a gentle correcting, but he said that my appearance may look weak, but I'm not weak. And how shall I come to you, as a simple or as a strong person? But Paul corrected these churches, and we read in Galatians. Some time back we studied Galatians, and Galatian church had Judaizers that had come into the church after Paul had left, and was teaching that they needed to keep also the sacrificial system, and that the men must be circumcised. And Paul said that we're saved, that you can't be saved through those things. You're not saved by any act, any kind of work, anything you can do, anything you can buy or give. None of those things can save us. We're only saved through faith. Paul said, by faith, through faith. We're saved by faith, and we're saved by our faith continuing. We must continue in our faith toward Christ, because if we're double-minded, we're unstable. As James said, a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. So we're saved from faith to faith. So we're going to continue next week with some other books of the New Testament. But the thing to remember now in this time, this is a time of trouble for many of us. But one thing we can count on is God is faithful. He cares about you, He loves you, and He wants your best. And our best for Him is our love for Him, our prayerfulness to Him, our goodness to others, and our trust. We must trust Him. And so, this has been another short I would like to try to keep these things short, but I would that you would read, if you have the Sunday school book, that you would read this lesson. It's a very good lesson. Read the book of Romans, especially the first chapter, 1 Corinthians, and God bless you and keep you. And I'll see you soon.